All right, today we're joined by Ryan Kantor of Tigernet and Shakin the Southland. Ryan, it's been a long time coming. I feel like I reached out to you and canceled on you, and then I talked about inviting you on an episode, but forgot to actually invite you on an episode. So it's finally coming to fruition. So thanks for joining us, Ryan.
Yeah, no, I owe you. I think Matthew created my logo for my YouTube channel, and you were a guest talking baseball, so glad to get you back.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna hit you with a hard hitting question right off the bat. What's wrong with Clemson?
How deep do you want me to go in this right now? But we can start.
That was kind of a joke question that we had written out. We kind of thought we would get that reaction, but more specifically, more talking about the NC State game. Like, what are kind of your takeaways from that? I know me and Drew talked on this episode already about turnovers still being such a bad issue, and but I was kind of interested to see what your perspective was on this NC State game.
Yeah, I mean, so sticking specifically to the NC State game, right? If you make that field goal before half, then you avoid the blunder at the end of the game when you settle for the field goal. You go for it. 50-50, you get it, and then you're tied, right? So that's how big that missed field goal was. If you don't have the pick six, which is probably the offensive line's fault, you probably win the game and don't even. That's not even a discussion. So again, they make a few crucial mistakes, pretty much always on offense, and that's why they lose. They're just not talented enough to make a ton of mistakes. I mean, you think like that 2016 game they lost to Pitt. How many mistakes do they have to make to actually lose that one game? I mean, they just picks in the ends. I mean, they were doing crazy stuff before they finally lost a game. They could get away with it so many times. That 2016 game against NC State, they were just horrible, and they still pulled it out. And they don't have that huge of a talent advantage right now. Dabo's never been, he's not Mario Cristobal, but he's never been a great in-game like strategist. And it doesn't matter when you just are massively more talented and better than everyone. But when it's on the edge, that stuff costs you a game.
Absolutely. So if Ryan Cantor was king of Clemson for the day one, what are your priorities with fixing this program?
Yeah, look, I can't do what Dabo's done in the past. Obviously, he's a Hall of Fame coach, and honestly, like I wouldn't be a good coach, right? I don't know the X's and O's and that level of detail. Dabo's ability to just relate to high school kids, like, can't do that, let alone recruit them, right? But I do feel like there's like some stuff where like let me be. You don't even have to pay me. Just let me be your veto guy. Like just let me tell. No, no, that's very dumb. That's a very bad decision. Like I don't need football experience. I don't need to be an analyst for 10. Some of the stuff's obvious, right? Like for 3 years we just don't use the portal at all. And I'm not saying we should be Florida State, but like coming into the year, I was saying we should probably get a defensive end and a wide receiver. Seemed very obvious to me. And Dabo, on the other hand, believes in Maskell and Bo Collins and Adam Randall. Like, why am I right and he's wrong? He's watching them in practice. He was a wide receiver. He was a wide receivers coach, and my analysis on Adam Randall is better than his. To me, I feel like he's such a relationship guy that it's actually like he can't see as clearly because he knows him personally. He knows his mom. He loves the kid. Whereas to me, it's more like they're fantasy players, right? So I'm just looking at them completely objectively. And I think it's not like he forgot football. So that's the only thing that makes sense to me is he's not looking at it as objectively as we are as fans. 'Cause I've never met the guys, right? So it's easy for me to be objective. So yeah, so you're talking about things I would do. I would get the best coaches. I wouldn't get guys that I have personal relationships with. Um, Partially because I think it's awkward. I wouldn't want to hire my best pal to report to me because if he's bad, that's going to be super awkward and ruin a friendship. So I wouldn't do that. I would get the best coaches available. Imagine if Sam Pittman from Arkansas is available, elite wide offensive line coach. I mean, I would love to have him on staff somehow. And I would, and it's awkward now because it's kind of made it awkward. But I think you have to replace starters who are currently starters that on offense that are not great. They're okay. They're not bad players. They don't stink, but they're not as good as guys in the portal. Find guys who are better than them, especially if they're not seniors, right? And say, hey, you're going to have to sit for a year. You're not the best option, right? That's going to feel icky, and it's not going to be as fun for Dabo at least. But I think those are some obvious things he's going to have to do if he wants to actually be more than a fringe top 25 program moving forward.
You bring up the awkwardness of hiring former players and people well. I can't remember where exactly I saw it this past week, but someone brought up the point that don't hire someone that you can't fire. And Dabo surrounded himself with a lot of people that if you have to go and fire those guys, there's going to be a lot of awkward conversations. It kind of leads into my next question. You brought up Sam Pittman. I think the two personalities of Dabo and Pittman on the same coaching staff would be quite interesting. But what staff changes do you see actually coming to fruition this offseason?
I mean, who knows, right? Like, I mean, I could totally speculate, and I will for fun with you, but uh, I think that there's a lot of guys who are on 1 year, like this is their last year of their contract, so he wouldn't have to fire him per se, right? He can just give him a different contract for a different role. I think that's probably feasible. I mean, the offensive line guys are regressing; their PFF grades are going down a lot of the time. Offensive line's a huge issue. The recruiting class right now isn't good, so I think that uh, is not a good sign if you're the offensive line coach. Wide receiver, they do have great wide receivers coming in, right? So that's a check in Tyler Grisham's box. And the wide receiver play, they don't have elite wide receivers, but I guess what I'd want to know is, did Tyler Grisham believe that Bo Collins and Adam Randall were a great 1-2 punch on the outside? If he believed that, I think that's a commentary on him. If he was saying, Coach, we need to go get someone. These guys are good quality players, but they're not national championship starters. And Dabo said, no, we don't do that. Then you can't blame Grisham, right? So that's where I don't like to go after individual coaches, but I do like to go after the process, right? Like CJ Spiller, he's never coached, never an analyst, nothing like that. He's a track coach in high school. You bring him in, he's an unpaid intern for a year, you make him the coach. Do I think he's a bad coach? Not really. I think he's actually done okay for the most part. I mean, there's some things I critique. Shipley's not developed for one. But I don't think he's terrible. I do think that process of how you chose him is terrible, right? He's your marquee recruit that you love and have a relationship with, so you bring him in and rush him into the role. That's a bad process. It's not a knock on him. That's a knock on the way Dabo's doing things, which is different.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. Moving on a little bit to this coming week, me and Drew just recorded a very pessimistic podcast about this upcoming game, but what are you kind of looking for / expecting coming up against Notre Dame this week?
I mean, this is probably the least I've ever looked forward to a Clemson game. I mean, I've got to watch it because I want to be able to talk about it intelligently and write about it, and I don't know, I can't. If the game's on, I have to be watching. I'll be going crazy otherwise. But I mean, they physically manhandled us last year, and we brought 4 guys back on the offensive line. Obviously, one's hurt, Walker Parks, but we're somehow worse on the offensive line. We were told we had all this depth, and we're struggling at right guard. We had to move a left tackle there because our both backup options have struggled. And Mitchell Mays and Harris Sewell, really, really low PFF grades at right guard, even though we're supposedly 10, 11 deep, which obviously we're not. So I don't see how they don't manhandle us physically even more than before. We're at home, so that's better. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to go into it expecting to lose by 2 touchdowns or more, and just kind of reset my expectations. And if we do better than that, then at least I'm not miserable. Coming in, I picked us for the year. I said we'd go 11-1. Maybe my one loss, or not maybe, but my one loss that I picked was actually at NC State because I kind of thought it was a trap game in between Miami and Notre Dame, so we'd win both those. So I got that one right, but I've been disappointed 3 other times where I was expecting something very different. So now I'm changing my expectations.
Yeah, I think that's about where both me and Drew are at right now. Is I'm just kind of going to this game as a fan and looking to have fun at the game and not worry, and that's not dependent on the outcome of the game. I know going to Clemson, I've been going my whole life, and I have a great time going to Clemson football games no matter what happens because I grew up in the Tommy Bowden era, so I've been through it. So I think that's
Tommy Bowden never had a year worse than 4-4 in the ACC, so it might be worse than any year.
Yeah, we're creeping up on that. So.
Yeah.
Ryan, you've been very outspoken on the transfer portal and Clemson's kind of lack of utilizing it. Obviously, there's some holes in the roster. in last off season they made attempts at a couple of guys that just didn't come to fruition. Um, do you see them having a little bit more success and going at it a little bit harder this year? And which position group might you see a little bit of improvement through the portal?
Yeah, I do. I think last year, I don't think Dabo is like against ever using the portal no matter what. I think he's been tentative to replace a guy who is a starter, who's not great but isn't bad and does things the right way and is all in and tries, and doesn't doesn't deserve like, hey, you're not all in, you should be replaced. It's just you're not going to win a championship with that kind of guy. He's been hesitant to replace those guys, but when you go 6-6 or something, 7-5, we'll see where we end up. Um, I think it's a lot easier to do that, right? So I also think that last year uh, he and it's not totally his fault. So let's give him a little grace. The COVID year is really weird. He didn't know. I think no one expected both Rook and Tyler Davis to come back, right? And Jalen Phillips and Sheridan Jones both came back. Obviously, different spots in the secondary, but I think he just didn't manage the roster and didn't see all that. So he kind of, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but wasted a scholarship on Paul Tyson. And then I've heard like I was really hoping they'd go after his name was DeBose, receiver from Charlotte, or Ali Jennings, receiver from Old Dominion. There was a lot of options. Obviously, Jamari Thrash at Louisville was killing it, and he was at Georgia State, so I think we can recruit at Louisville's level, right? Um, but he didn't see that he had room. Obviously, those spots open up, but he's very conservative about kicking guys off scholarship who are former walk-ons. So he played a little too aggressive in giving out scholarships to freshmen, to not save space, and then too conservative with his expectations of attrition. This year, the recruiting class is small. There's room. I think you'll see people transfer out after a 6-6 tumultuous year, where it's probably not a lot of fun to be a Clemson football player right now. So I think there'll be plenty of room. I expect him to take a defensive end. If not, Cade Denhoff is your starter next year. Um, so I think if he doesn't take a defensive end, then he's not giving us his best at that point. Best is the standard, and that means giving your best, not going 15-0, right? But I think if he's not trying to get a defensive end, that's not his best. I think maybe Trotter maybe comes back, but if not, I think you got to get a linebacker, um, maybe a safety, depending on who leaves. Mickens, I feel like Mickens and Venables could both be back, and then you still have Sherrod Koval and Khalil Barnes. So that may be a spot we're okay. On offense, I'd love to see him go out and get a wide receiver. Otherwise, you're just putting a lot of pressure on Wesco to be a day one starter. And I think that's unnecessarily risky. And then the biggest question is you're going to bring back a ton of guys in the offensive line. Putnam's gone, but you could bring back 4 others. Are you willing to replace one of them who's, let's just say, doesn't have a good PFF grade this year with a guy who's older than him and traditionally better than him, over the course of their career? Are you willing to say you were a starter last year, but you were okay? You don't stink. You're not a bad kid. You're not failing to be all in, but this kid's better than you, so we're going to bring him in. I don't know if he'll go that far, but I would be stunned if he brought 0 guys in, especially at defensive end.
Yeah, I'm really looking for an offensive line upgrade, and I know me and Drew don't pay that much attention to recruiting, so we're not sure about exactly what the offensive line incoming class is looking like. But I like one point that you made is that a lot of fans probably overlook is that it's easy to make these roster management decisions without that personal aspect that you get from recruiting these kids in high school. And, kind of Dabo's main goal is to make them into Clemson men and stuff like that. So I think he does lose his focus on the output on the field a lot, and focuses more on that off the field type stuff and keeping those personal relationships growing.
You're definitely right, and it's funny because it cuts both ways. When that was still true, but we were winning national championships, I remember I wrote an article. I forgot the exact title, but something along the lines of like it means more. I definitely didn't use the SEC phrase, but something like it means more when you win the right way or something like that. And it was about that. Like we're doing everything the right way. We're not cutting players. We're growing them as men. Talked about how like one of the players got baptized after doing something wrong, and he genuinely does care about them as people. And he would say that the winning national championships isn't the main goal. And that rang like so beautiful and was like, take my money of day. This is great. But now I was just listening to him pretty recently on the Family Values podcast with David Pollock. And he said, winning's not the number one goal. And now when you're 6-6 and you say that, and they weren't that bad at the time, but like now it sounds really bad. So I'm admitting my own hypocrisy there, right? Like you're winning and character's number one. It's amazing, even if you're not winning championships. But when you're bad and you're not acknowledging that is still what you're paid for, then to me it sounds bad.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it's all about perspective. Fans are willing to put up with or enjoy things like that when you are winning, but when you're saying things like that in the midst of a 4-4 season, it comes across a little differently.
Especially the best is the standard quote. When you're 4-4, it doesn't sound very good to have that plastered on the wall everywhere.
Yeah, well, the most true quote was the fun is in the winning. Like,
yeah.
It's not a lot of fun right now, right? I wonder if he'd say that again.
We actually talked about that. One of our Fact or Fictions this week was, is Clemson football is not fun anymore. And I kind of brought up that point is that if the fun is in the winning, then you're right. But then I also brought up the fact of growing up in a Tommy Bowden era and having a great time during that. So it just depends on your perspective of where you're looking at it from.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, I really appreciate you taking some time and joining us. Always great following along with you on Twitter and YouTube, and you put out great content, so I appreciate it. To all our listeners, check them out on Twitter, Tigernet Shakin the Southland. Ryan, we got to do this again, maybe baseball season.
Yeah, definitely check me out on YouTube. Just search my name, Ryan Kantor. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.